my name's Ash, and welcome to Paper with Gold, the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. I want to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which I am recording, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So I know that this is a pretty embarrassing confession, but I believe I'm at the age now where I'm starting to be left behind when it comes to new social media platforms. And I feel a little bit hello, fellow kids, as in that I need help setting up an iPhone when it comes to like adapting to a new app. So please excuse a lot of my ignorance for the next hour or so. I am very well versed in Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. No, I'm not calling it X. And I am somewhat versed in Snapchat, but the one that eludes me is TikTok. I just can't seem to wrap my brain around it. It's too fast for me, which is ironic given I do have ADHD. But for me, it just seems too scary and I just can't with it. And plus I waste way too much time on apps anyway. So I feel I've missed the boat and I'm okay with that. I'm giving you my full disclosure here now, but I know that there is an entire generation that is not only on TikTok, but almost has been raised on it. And TikTok has over 1 billion active users, and the daily time spent on TikTok averages around like 58 minutes and 24 seconds as of 2024, which is a lot of time. In Australia in 2022, more than half of TikTok users were aged under 24, and in the US, TikTok has over 102.3 million users, with 36.7% of them between the ages of 18 to 24. So I'm fully aware I'm not on the bandwagon, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. It's insane popularity. So while most of what I know about TikTok has been discovered researching this episode, I'm also fully aware that there is a massive resurgence of pro-eating disorder content being pushed onto people on this platform. So that's what we're talking about today. So it's pretty obvious that I would be doing this topic a massive disservice by doing this alone. So I had to get someone who not only knew this app, but has spent a long time studying it. So today's guest is a senior lecturer at Charles Sturt School of Psychology. She has completed a PhD in sports psychology, and her work has addressed human-animal interaction, animal-assisted therapy, gendered experiences of clinical psychology, and psychological diagnosis, as well as consent, coercive control, and domestic violence. But as recently as August 2024, she led a study that looked at the impact of pro-ana TikTok content on body image dissatisfaction and internalization of societal beauty standards, which is what brings her here today. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Rachel Hogg to today's episode. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Oh, I'm so excited. And yeah, I plan on learning a lot today. So I'm very glad to have almost a TikTok expert with me. So before we start, I want to put a blanket trigger warning here that this episode may touch on some pro-ana, pro-eating disorder content discussions. It may potentially talk about depictions of dieting and eating disorder behaviors, so just be mindful of that if you choose to listen on. But also if you want to just peace out here, I do not blame you, and we'll see you on the next one. I also want to put a caveat on this episode that it should not be used as a guide on what to look for on TikTok and should not be used to scope out more content to follow. I am sure I will make my feelings known about what I think about this pro-eating disorder content. I'm sure you can probably already guess if you've listened to our previous episode on social media. But I think it's totally wrong, damaging, and reckless and harmful. So please do not seek it out. Please. But now let's get into it. Rachel, can you please tell me a little bit about what your background is and what led you to conduct this research?
Yeah, look, great question. My background, obviously, broadly speaking, is in psychology. So as you said, I did a PhD in sports psychology a number of years ago. And I think my career, if anything, has been typified by an interest in what lies at the margins of psychology as a discipline. And there's a whole lot of kind of connective tissue around that. But one of the key areas that has directed my career in the last, probably the last 5 years especially, has actually been thinking about psychology and its contribution, particularly in mental health contexts, from a feminist point of view and from a critical psychology point of view. And we might circle back to this later, but there's certainly a lot of institutionalized harm that can occur in our discipline. So I was really interested in that. And I also, as somebody who has, I've always been quite physically active and quite interested in exercise and sports psychology and things like that, I did some research many years ago on exercise dependence, which is a condition that is still not actually formally included in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that psychology uses. And I was really interested in that because it was on the margins. And so, in terms of what we're about to talk about today, one of the things that really directed me to this research was, there's a lot of really explicitly harmful content that exists. But I had spent some time critiquing wellness culture and right? And critiquing some of the standards, some of the ways in which we are sold, self-care and self-development. And in a neoliberal society where you are told that you are your own project, and that one of the ways that you can fulfill your destiny as a person is to be, quotes, the best version of yourself that you could ever be. For women especially, that rhetoric normalizes so many disordered things.
And it almost like it puts it as like it is your duty to meet these standards as well.
It's your morality. It's a measure of your morality
and your value
your
to
discipline.
Society.
Yes, absolutely. And so it's impossible to talk about this without talking about the body, because the body is a site of control. It is a way for all of us, but particularly for women, often are socialized to consider bodily control as a form of self-discipline and self-care. And so going to the gym and having a really intense interest in things like healthy eating, for example, are not things as a society that we generally question. They're things that we reward, they're things that we value, and you see this in so much of the wellness culture content that is out there.
Your body is almost your visual business card almost. It's like,
absolutely.
I mean, we have discussed at length on this podcast that you cannot determine someone's health or, anything by looking at them. So we fundamentally reject that idea, obviously. But it is so much in the way that society exists, there is just this acceptance that visually you need to be performing at all times.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we'll go into this as we continue, but that narrative creates a level of social acceptability around quite disordered content, because that disordered content is not presented as disordered. It is presented as health consciousness. And so what you see is that body distress is often reconfigured to be presented as body transformation. So we reward and we moralize and we even monetize self-discipline and self-improvement. And I think the patriarchy really benefits from that perpetual distraction that so many of us fight against on a daily basis of attempting to meet this ever-evolving beauty standard that has been created for women. And within this lens, even cosmetic enhancements can and often are positioned as a form of self-care. Now, whether or not I'm not, going to put a particular position on the line in terms of cosmetic enhancement, but the way that it is positioned, I think, warrants critique. So that was kind of my broader, lens to going into this research. But my co-author, Madison, she was on TikTok quite a lot during the pandemic. And she started to notice that her feed was giving her all of this content that she had not sought, that was quite, pro-anorexia content. And so she was quite concerned by this. And there's also a great deal of, the gym talk, fitness inspo content that she was seeing as well. So together we started to talk about these things, and that was kind of the genesis for what followed.
Oh my God, I knew I got the right person on to talk about this stuff. And I have a feeling that this, because we've been meaning to do an episode on wellness culture, and I have a feeling we might be asking you back.
Very happy to talk about that topic. Nothing makes me more annoyed.
Oh my God, thank goodness. I think there's this new movement where we're kind of like revolting against the wellness industry, and it can't happen soon enough, to be honest. So before we get into your research, I want to talk about exactly what TikTok is. I know most people are like, we're not living under a rock, Ash. But just in case someone doesn't, I want to lay some groundwork, which I know is ironic coming from someone who doesn't use it. But TikTok is a global social media platform that is designed for creating, sharing, and discovering short videos. It was released in 2017 and today has over 4.5 billion downloads. And I would say it has fundamentally changed how social media works in general. As someone who works in advertising, we've seen a massive shift towards mobile first and video-led content as a whole, way over static visuals. And there's this big shift and push from brands to have a presence on the TikTok as an app, as well as partnering with influencers and creating branded content. Oftentimes it's not disclosed, which I have issues with, and is the primary way that we speak to a youth audience, given that there is a very large concentration of young people on the app. TikTok is owned by the Chinese tech company ByteDance, and there is a Chinese version of TikTok actually called Douyin, or Douyin. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, which was first created in 2016, and then it was rebranded and relaunched as a separate app, TikTok, a year later. So actually you can't have Douyin outside of China, and TikTok doesn't exist in China. So they're two separate apps but owned by the same company, and they're basically the same thing. Now, I won't get into it too much, but obviously the app has faced some controversies over its Chinese ownership and over concerns that the Chinese government could be using it for propaganda purposes and to collect data on its users. And the app is currently banned in India and Pakistan. It is currently facing a ban in the US unless the company is spun off and financially separated but this is a congressionally imposed deadline, which is likely to fall in 2025. But given what we know about 2025, who knows what's going to happen there? We'll watch this space. But again, we can't get into that. Otherwise, we'll be here for a while. But again, just wanted to lay some groundwork there. Before we jump into your actual study, can you tell us how the TikTok algorithm works? I know you've touched on it just briefly, but how does that differ to, say, like Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, for example?
Yeah, great question. A couple of key points, and I'll talk about the algorithm. One of the most important features of the algorithm is that we actually don't really know exactly how it works. It's something that tech companies keep pretty close to their chests, which
Red
is
flag.
Yes, in itself an interesting feature. But one of the key points of distinction between TikTok and most other apps is that your account is much more dictated by, or the content that you see is much more dictated by accounts that you don't follow than accounts that you do. And that is in contrast to other apps. So on Instagram, there is suggested content. There's suggested content on Facebook as well. But on TikTok, that is a much more dominant feature of the platform. So a lot of users spend quite a bit of time on the For You page. And that page, you get rolling videos, and a certain percentage of those, sometimes up to around 50%, I think, are not from accounts that you follow. So that's one key point to know.
And just to jump in really quickly, for anyone who's interested on not seeing suggested content on Instagram, you can actually change that in your settings. You can snooze suggested content for 30 days. Yes, you do have to keep going back and toggling that feature. But if you're so sick of not seeing stuff that you follow, you can snooze that. Just a helpful tip, because I've done it on multiple things. So I'm like, why is this on my feed? And you can also hide it, say not interested. You can hide it as offensive, like I do with dieting stuff that comes onto my feed for some reason. So yes, just a little tip there.
Yeah, no, great point. So a couple of other features that I think are relevant here, particularly when we're talking about disordered eating content or any kind of body-based content. So you mentioned that the types of videos that you see, moving rather than still images, there's a real preference for videos. That is absolutely correct, of course. And one of the things that's significant is that while there is some cross-pollination between Instagram and TikTok, we do find generally a trend on TikTok towards videos that show the full image of a person, of the content creator's body. So even if it is not directly body related content, a lot of the footage on TikTok is more likely to include a full image of someone else's physical body. Whereas
Interesting.
on Instagram, you're much more likely to get the talking heads kind of
Yeah.
situation like we have now.
Selfie kind of
Right.
stuff. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that's key. Another thing that's relevant is that the kind of videos that do well are typically very short. So, in the space of even 60 seconds, it is possible to consume content from a whole range of different creators, all about the same theme, within a very short time frame. And I suspect that the influence of that is a little bit different to what we've seen historically in advertising. It's always true to say that for years and years and years, women have been exposed to disordered body ideals, and men as well, but particularly women. And that has come through popular culture and the media and all of these different things. But the overlay of particular standards being presented by different content creators in such a quick succession is a relatively new kind of novel part of social media. So
Yeah.
that's important to note. And
Yeah.
then
From an advertising point of view, we've just been told that first 3 seconds, it has to be, you have to be gripped in the first 3 seconds, because that's how long people have for. And actually that's been around for like the last maybe 5 years or so. Now it's shifting. Now they're saying opening second, it needs to be engaging, which I mean, as a creative person, that's tricky, because I mean, like I'm in the business of like storytelling, and that's a hard thing to do, is tell a story or hook someone into that story in the first second. It is very tricky, but there are people out there who are very good at it.
Yeah, and this is changing everything. It's even changing the music industry. I understand now that songs are being produced differently to fit into the frame of what they need for TikTok, because TikTok has a huge impact on music outcomes and things like that. So
Totally.
that's all happening. But there's also, going back to the algorithm for a second, we don't know exactly how it works, but we do know that it's a bit of a blunt instrument. And one of the saddest things that came from my research, or came from some of the reading that I did on this before we started to do the research, was that if you happen to be in a recovery phase from an eating disorder and you go onto TikTok and you search for anti-anorexia content, or content that is designed to support your recovery, and that content does exist. There is,
and
content
it has
of
been
that
helpful.
nature.
There are issues
Yes,
with it sometimes,
absolutely.
but again, go back and listen to our social media episode on that, because we discussed that at length. But yeah, it has its pros and it does have its cons. But yes,
Absolutely. But that content is there. But if you search for that content, you are then also disproportionately likely to be exposed to the exact opposite, to the pro anorexia content, because the algorithm is a blunt instrument and it goes, okay, this person's interested in body related things. The same thing has happened with the body positivity hashtag, which was designed to be a, countercultural revolutionary kind of thing, and has unfortunately been, decimated in many ways from the original objectives of the body positivity movement.
been totally co-opted. And
Absolutely.
Like, one of my least favorite things is like, oh, everybody has roles when they sit down, and as you see like this very thin person like bending over, and there's like, that's skin, honey.
Yeah.
Also,
Hashtag brave.
what about the people who have roles when they stand up? They're just as worthy of respect, validation, cheering, and positivity as everybody.
It's a little like the critique. I know a lot of millennials, which is the generation to which I belong, have reflected
Likewise.
with some kind of like revulsion at the fact that as teenagers we were told that Kate Winslet was very brave for getting nude in Titanic because of her obese body, and similar.
Jessica Simpson.
Oh, and like Renee Zellweger and Bridget Jones' Diary, like she desperately
a size 12. Ugh.
Scandal.
Oh my God.
Scandal. So look, all of these things are relevant, but there is something else that has two sort of levels of impact that I want to mention that's really salient to TikTok when it comes to disordered eating content. So most of the popular accounts that you see on Instagram, the people with the highest followers, are usually public figures. They are people like, and I'm just going to use her as an example, Abby Chatfield, right? Public figure, has quite a following. If somebody like Abby Chatfield posts, disordered eating content that we consider to be harmful, particularly to young people, there is likely to be some kind of reaction to that because she is a public figure. What is happening on TikTok is that we have largely a young audience creating content for a young audience. And while there are plenty of creators who are TikTok famous or become famous on the platform over time, many of those content creators on TikTok are not public figures. And so they are not subject to the quote unquote cancellation that somebody like Abby Chatfield or Jessica, Simpson or some, any kind of celebrity or public figure might be subject to if they were to post disordered content. So that's important to note. There's not the same sort of social checking mechanisms around it. But we also know from psychology research, and I'm thinking here about social comparison theory, we're all influenced by a lot of different information coming from different people. But one of the things that young people are especially influenced by is what their peers are saying. And the content that is being circulated on TikTok, as I said before, is created largely by young audiences that are very relatable to the people who are consuming that content. And that's really critical to note.
Yeah. And I think also, and I mean, I know you've touched on it, but it's important to like really hammer it home. The second you engage with one piece of content, you are just going to be just constantly fed the same thing, and probably in like a certain trajectory as well. So if you are only consuming, content from people who are smaller, you will probably only get that kind of content, which I know we've always talked about the importance of diversifying people's feeds, but I think there's also something to be said about the monetization factor of TikTok as well, which it's just how it works apparently in our society that thin bodies mean more money.
Absolutely. Yep. And one of the things that TikTok treads very carefully around not directly saying, because they're aware of the fact that it's probably not going to end well for them to directly say this, but what is often implied in a lot of their media releases off the back of research like the research that we conducted, which got a lot of media attention, and they were called upon to comment a number of times in the weeks following the release of that study. What they tiptoe around is the notion that, people are consuming this content. We're not making you watch it. You're choosing to watch it. And what I find really disingenuous about that is that to, I guess, draw an analogy, this is perhaps not the right analogy to draw, but if we take, if you imagine parents were to say, look, our children just like eating crap. That's all they want to eat. Ever. So we let them, that's a paternalistic kind of analogy, but to say that because the content is there and people are consuming it, that the consumer is responsible for their own consumption is so troubling to me, because one of the things I think about in this space and also in the context of domestic violence is that the types of harm that tend to have the most impact, that have the most cut through, are the forms of harm and abuse that reinforce the pain that we already hold, the beliefs that we already hold about ourselves. And we know that negative content tends to have cut through. And the reason that it has cut through for a lot of women particularly is because right from the day you are born, you are living and breathing and moving within the soup of a society that tells you that your body is for consumption and that your morality is contingent upon your ability to present a body that is palatable, not just to the male gaze, but also more broadly, in terms of fitness and well-being and health and all of those things that we were talking about before. So to express the idea that, people are consuming this content, so it's kind of on them, is really like giving kids cigarettes and saying, oh, well, they chose to suck on them. Of course they did. It's designed to be addictive. These platforms are designed to keep you on the platform for as long as possible.
Absolutely. And you totally touched on something I was going to mention is the addictive component of it. They're kind of absconding themselves of any kind of responsibility by saying, no, people have free will. They download our app. It's their choice that they're consuming. I would say it's absolutely akin to gambling, because you're taking that these people often don't have free will, because it's different from gambling in a sense, because while it does have the dopamine kind of cycle of just chasing that next high, you're constantly consuming. I think in an ever evolving digital world, social media often means connection. And we don't have as much connection in real life anymore, especially after COVID. Everything's so much more digital. People work from home more often, then they need that somewhat human connection. And what's the best way to get it is on your phone. And I think them completely ignoring very strategically ignoring is the addictive nature of it, this need for human connection, but also they know what they're doing. They've got so many engineers and very smart people designing this tech to keep you on it.
Absolutely. They've got a sophisticated understanding of not just marketing, but neurology and neuropsychology especially. And the profit margins of these big tech companies are linked to their ability to co-opt our reward systems. And you made a comment about gambling a second ago. You're right to draw a comparison there, because gambling would actually be much less attractive to us as people if you were guaranteed a reward. If you, every time you played the pokies, if you got a reward, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but stay with me here. If you got a reward every single time, rates of gambling would actually decrease. One of the things we know from conditioning, and I'm thinking here about operant conditioning, which is a classic sort of rats and stats kind of part of psychology, but we know from the research that somewhat counterintuitively, intermittent reinforcement is actually more effective than reinforcing every single response. So what these tech companies have done is they have really introduced this intermittent reinforcement model that provides you with dopamine. And as you said, connection is a big part of this. But it is a form of connection that is very kind of light in the LITE sense of the word, which creates, further problems. But one of the things that I've been asked to comment on many times, and particularly recently as the Australian government is, trying to work out their social media ban, people are always saying to me, what can we do to keep young people safe, especially young women, when it comes to this content? And
that is a question coming up, yes.
Yes, and perhaps I don't want to go too much into that yet before we talked about what this research actually looked like. But one of the things I would say to that is that the solution is not to upskill people to prevent harm. We place so much emphasis often on training and education strategies and all of those kind of things. And I think, no parent would think to themselves that I'm going to send my child to swimming lessons for a full year, make sure they're the strongest swimmer in Australia so that when I put them in a pool of sharks, they will be okay. No amount of swim training is going to keep a child safe in that circumstance. So training young women to, and educating people on how to be safe online is only useful to a point when the pool is full of sharks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, touching really quickly on the ban, but we will probably get to that eventually. For those who don't know, the Australian government it's in the House and the Senate, I think at the moment, and it has bipartisan support, but it is looking to ban social media under the age of 16. I have mixed feelings about this. I think I agree that there should be a limitation on social media and what teens are exposed to on social media. But I also think there is TikTok is a way for a lot of young people to consume politics, information, social activism, especially around like mobilization and organizing. It's a really important thing. And I do think that there is, I don't want to sound like a tinfoil hat person here, but there is a censorship element to that, which I do disagree with. But on the other hand, I think given how dangerous some of the content is, I think it's not a bad thing to limit these people. But to your point as well, by just banning it and then saying, okay, now you're 16, go have fun, people, I think we know what happens in the brain when you have restriction. People will just crave it more, and then they'll consume more of it when they're allowed it. So I think like a blanket ban doesn't work. I think free reign doesn't work. I think absolutely the tech companies need to be held responsible more than they absolutely are. And I think the emphasis might be on the wrong people. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. So now I would like to just, let's dive into your study, because I'd love to know a little bit more about it. Can you tell us the background of it, what it looks like, and what were the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to put some context, we've given some context already, but to put a bit of context around this research, one of the pieces of information that we were really conscious of going into this research is that 1 in 50 Australians feel that some part of their body is flawed. Nearly half of Australian young people are dissatisfied with how their body looks. Now, we know that social media has always facilitated social comparison, but harmful online content circulates quite readily on TikTok, and there are a lot of very young, in fact, I think over 1 billion users on TikTok who are children and teenagers. So that was part of the reason why we focused in the way that we did. One of the other points that I want to note here is that it's easy in psychology, particularly clinical psychology, for a lot of our research to focus on clinical populations. So in this context, that would be to look at what is going on for people with either a previous or an ongoing diagnosis of an eating disorder. We did not look at that cohort, and there were 2 reasons for that. One was in terms of getting ethics approval. We knew that focusing on a cohort with existing diagnostic criteria meant that the study was going to be a lot higher risk, and there's a need for that research, but that wasn't the project that we wanted to do.
Harm reduction, love it.
Yes. But also we were conscious of the fact, and I think this is something that's kind of concerned me for a really long time, we often tend to draw quite a binary in psychology between those with diagnoses and those without. And, you know, one of the things that has come up as a part of doing this research is that I've had a lot of conversations with women, and I cannot name a single woman who has not mentioned at some point, you know, for most of us, negative thoughts about your body are not the exception to the rule, they are the rule.
Yeah.
And that is the devil that sits on your shoulder a lot of the time, regardless of whether you might be engaging in any kind of disordered eating behaviors or whether you are anywhere close to what we consider, you know, an eating disorder diagnosis.
Yeah, I think anybody who lives lives at a higher weight or in fat bodies, who have experienced any kind of weight stigma, will probably already be nodding their heads and being like, well, yes. This is basically prescribed and demanded of us, is that I'm required to engage in restrictive eating.
Absolutely. And that message,
dissatisfaction.
Absolutely. And that messaging is not always contained within, you know, a negative frame. It can be as simple as, you know, a friend of mine had a surgical procedure, lost a lot of weight as a result of that. And she said to me, I never realized how much people must hate me because I hadn't thought about it, but once I lost weight, all of a sudden, all of these things that had never been said to me, all these positive things about how beautiful I am were being said. And I suddenly had this like revisionist history of what my life before that must have meant to these people. So, you know, even somebody saying, oh my gosh, you look great. Have you lost weight? You know, even positive comments can reinforce exactly what you're describing.
Oh, that's so sad. And then now that then just probably triggers a lot in them thinking, okay, I can never get back to that weight again. And then here we go.
All kinds of doors get opened in those conversations, right? But anyway, on to this study. So
I love a tangent. I apologize. Bring me back in.
Let's go. But no, to talk about this study. So what did we do? This was an experimental research study. So we had a control group and we measured participants before and after our intervention, quote unquote, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it's important to note that the, you know, experimental research is often held up as the kind of gold standard in psychology. It's, you know, high levels of rigor and control. And there's lots of positives about that kind of research. So I think the findings of this study have certainly been considered more impactful because it is experimental. But I also do want to note the fact that there are many different forms of study that are required around this, not just experimental research, and we can perhaps talk about that later. But what did we do? We had a sample of 273 female identifying participants. All of them were current TikTok users. So we didn't ask anybody to create a TikTok account or anything like that. These were all people who were already on TikTok, and they were aged 18 to 28 years of age. So we randomly allocated participants into two groups, and participants in the experimental group were exposed to 7 to 8 minutes of pro-anorexia and fitspiration content. So this content ranged from openly disordered content to the kind of sort of benign, you know, I love my gym life, here's my juice cleanse routine, here are some, you know, dieting tips or workout advice. But we wanted to have a range of content. So we had content that was, you know, talking quite openly about restricting food intake and losing weight. And then we had some more benign, you know, garden variety kind of stuff, which I think is probably just as warranting of scrutiny, but we wanted that range of content. So we had people watch 7 to 8 minutes of that content. And then we had a control group who received around the same amount of time. They watched 7 to 8 minutes of neutral content. So these were TikTok videos that we stitched together of scenes of nature, a couple of cooking, animals, that kind of content, pretty benign stuff.
So it was a sort of sample of, you obviously just didn't let them loose on the app. You
Correct.
You created the content.
We curate, absolutely.
I was going to say that would make sense as a control measure.
Yes, absolutely. So for the study to be systematic, and also just because TikTok content often gets removed, and we knew that some of the pro-anorexia content might be more likely to get removed if it was reported, we stitched together this content. So we had a single, you know, you sat and watched those videos roll one after another.
I would be interested to know, and I wonder if you are sorry if I'm beating you to it. I would wonder how long on the app it would take for someone who's scrolling a neutral feed to be fed something like that. I can imagine it would be very quick.
There's a great study to be done about that, and remind me, we can circle back to that because I actually do want to talk about that. But before we go down that, I have to make a mental note of this. So what we did, we measured a number of things, but two of the things that we measured at pre and post test were body image satisfaction and attitudes towards beauty standards, or internalization of beauty standards. We measured those two things before participants watched videos, and then we measured those things afterwards. We also measured symptoms of disordered eating and a few other things as well. We asked them lots of questions about their TikTok usage. We asked them about the kind of content that they saw coming up on their For You page and all of that kind of stuff as well, which helped to give some context to who the participant sample were and whether they sort of reflected the average TikTok user. As I said before, we screened anybody, so we excluded anyone with a past or current eating disorder diagnoses, and it's important to note that in the context of some of the findings that I'm about to talk about. So what we observed was that there was an immediate decrease in body dissatisfaction for the experimental group. And they also, that experimental group who watched that kind of harmful content, showed an increase in internalization of beauty standards from before watching the content to afterwards. Now, the reason that we measured internalization of beauty standards is because one of the things that we know from the literature is that simply being exposed to harmful content doesn't necessarily lead to harmful psychological impacts. What we know is that harm tends to come when you have exposure plus acceptance of that information as the standard to which you should aspire. So when it goes from just being what you're seeing to you thinking, okay, I'm seeing this and this applies to me, and this is the standard. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the internalization of beauty standards. So basically what happened was we saw this effect for the experimental group, but the reason that we had a control group was so that we could benchmark the experimental effect against the effect for the control group. We didn't see any change in internalization of beauty standards for the control group. We did see, and this was really interesting, we saw a decrease in body dissatisfaction for the control group as well as the experimental group. Now, the experimental effect was still significant. So what that really means is that relative to the control group, we saw a much larger decrease in body dissatisfaction for the experimental group, as we expected. But we weren't really expecting to see a change for the control group when it came to body dissatisfaction. So that was really interesting. And this is why you have a control group, because you need to be able to, it helps you to unpack why you're seeing what you're seeing. So in terms of explanations for that effect, we're not 100% sure. There's always, a level of speculation when you're trying to figure out what these kinds of things mean. But I think there's two possible explanations here. One is that the act of completing the body dissatisfaction scale twice may have had an effect on people. So nothing to do with the content that they're exposed to. Just simply being asked questions about how satisfied you are with your body might have led to higher levels of rumination and some, negative reflection for people. And if that's the case for the control group, then it's also possibly the case for the experimental group. So we need to keep that in mind when we interpret our findings. The other possible explanation that I think could be interesting to consider when it comes to that control group, and this circles right back to the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about the nature of TikTok content, even though the control group did not see any disordered eating or fitspiration or, body-focused content in that sense, some of the videos that we included for the control group did include imagery that was of somebody's body. So you could see somebody, you could see a person. They might have just been walking the dog, but they were, or playing with their dog. But you could still see a human body in some of the footage. And I'm curious as to whether even very benign exposure to other people's bodies in social media videos has a little bit of an effect on how satisfied we feel about our own. So they're just some sort of speculatory kind of comments to note. But that was the key experimental finding.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest, because I think the lack of representation in general on social media, unless you are actively seeking out fat acceptance kind of content or people in larger bodies and who are actively I call them fat influencers, people at higher weights who are actively talking about body acceptance and those kind of things. That's not being pushed. You have to actively often seek that, but also, and as a whole, TikTok, I think, is very much overpopulated with straight-sized people.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of other details, I guess, that might be interesting to consider here. One of them is, first of all, in terms of the dosage rate. And now when I say dosage rate, what I'm referring to is the fact that participants were only, and I say only with a little bit of caution, because obviously we had to really carefully consider the ethics of this research, because, the findings do suggest, as we know now, that even small amounts of exposure can have an effect. But because the average TikTok user is on the platform for, I think it's 1.5 hours a day. And in our research, 30% of the female participants in our study were spending somewhere between 2 to 5 hours per day on the platform. Okay. So they're spending a lot longer than around, 8 minutes. I remember saying to my co-author, don't be flummoxed if we don't find an experimental effect. When you don't find an experimental effect as a researcher, it's possible because there is no experimental effect to be found. But another possibility, and this was one that I raised with my co-author, was that watching less than 10 minutes of disordered TikTok content may not, I felt before we did this research, may not have actually been enough to elicit an effect, even though the content may be harmful. And if you were to ask people to watch videos for 30 minutes, maybe you see an effect. So we had that kind of caveat in our minds. I was also thinking about the possibility that TikTok users in the study might be a little bit sort of inoculated to the effects of the content, because they are on average spending, pretty significant periods of time on the platform. So it was actually, this is a bit of a disclosure of sorts, because I suppose I'm suggesting that I wasn't really sure that my own research was going to find what I thought it would find, but we were cautious about this idea that, we knew that 8 minutes or so of content might not actually elicit an effect, even though there may be an effect to be had. So that's one of the most compelling and also shocking parts of the study findings. Often, people say to me, what can we do about this problem? And one of the most obvious answers is to say, limit your time on social media apps. And there is some value to doing that. But the findings of our study kind of also suggest that it doesn't take very long for this kind of content to have this kind of effect as well. So that's important to note. Very short periods of exposure can have an immediate negative effect on young TikTok users. And I think that's really, really valuable to consider. But something else that I wanted to note, and I want to be really clear about the fact that this was not a statistically significant finding. I'm pointing to this as a potentially clinically significant finding, which is a different thing altogether. But one of the questions that we asked people was, how much time are you spending on average on the platform? And we had two groups of people who were at the higher end, and I mentioned before, around 30% of the sample were either on the platform to 2 to 3 hours a day, or we classed them as extreme users if they were on the platform for 3 or more hours per day. Now, we included a measure in our study of eating disorder symptomology. And for those two groups who were on the platform for either 2 to 3 hours a day or 3+ hours a day, both of those groups had cutoff scores on the eating disorder symptomology scale right below the cutoff for what would be considered clinically significant symptomology. Now, I'm not saying that that would qualify somebody for a diagnosis. As we know, diagnosis is predicated on a number of different pieces of information, not just the results of a single scale. But what I am saying is that if a psychologist or a GP or even a psychiatrist was to administer a scale like this in a clinical setting, and the average person in these high user groups is falling just below the threshold for what is considered clinically significant, there's a reasonable chance that that would lead to further investigation. And I say all of this in context to the fact that we screened for eating disorders. So this is a sample of participants who did not qualify or did not report having a diagnosis of an eating disorder, but in those high usage groups, that they were right below the threshold for what is considered clinically significant disordered eating. And I think that speaks to, look, to be completely honest, I think it speaks to the normalizing of eating disorders. And psychology draws a line between what's clinically significant and what's not. And often that has a lot to do with pragmatic factors, such as somebody's weight and the level of risk that is perceived to be apparent for their health. But to me, this speaks to the fact that some level of disordered engagement with eating and or your body is not really the exception to the rule. And if that is the case, one of the questions I have, and I think this is a kind of a theoretical question for psychology that we really struggle with, and it's come up, you mentioned ADHD before, it's come up recently in terms of ADHD diagnoses for women. If the scale tips where we have more people who have a type of diagnosis than not. What does that mean? Because one of the foundations of diagnosis is that it's not the norm, that it is the exception to the rule. That's part of how we, draw boundaries around what's considered normal and normative and what's not.
I think they're seeing that a lot with things like atypical anorexia, in air quotes, because only 6% of people with anorexia nervosa present underweight.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
technically, and a vast majority of people at higher weights will experience exactly the same clinical criteria for anorexia.
Yep. And are ignored.
Yeah, except their BMI is not doesn't meet the DSM, which would imply that atypical anorexia, quote unquote, isn't actually atypical at all.
Exactly.
So I think,
exactly.
Yeah, but because things are just so freaking slow to catch up, it's just.
But I also think it's a question, and I mean, this is something I've spent some time thinking about, because I'm real, and this is probably another conversation altogether, but as a feminist academic, there's a lot of tensions for me professionally navigating feminism in academia, particularly as a psychology academic, because psychology has defined itself as a science, and science and activism have always been very much separate from one another, or we've tried to treat them as separate from one another. And part of the authority of science is that we present a level of objectivity, and we're also supposed to be apolitical. And increasingly, my academic practice is explicitly political. Now, I want to say, if there are any budding academics who are listening to this, I do want to say that I think you have every right, particularly as a young academic scholar, to be cautious in your stance and in your activism and in your politics, in your career. It's easier for me now to be political and sometimes controversial and sometimes very critical of my discipline, because I'm a tenured academic. I'm in a permanent academic position. I've got reasonable levels of job security. Doesn't mean that, there's still potentially consequences for me sometimes, but I'm not subject to the whims of a very casualized workforce in the way that some of my peers are. And that is something that creates conditions for me to challenge the discipline a lot more than I would have done maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it also takes time to become aware of some of the things that are around you. But one of the things I did earlier this year, and have spent some time thinking about since, is to comb back through the history of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatry and Psychology, and consider all of the ways in which women have been subjugated and pathologized and harmed by the systems of psychology and the systems of diagnosis. And when it comes to eating disorders, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to consider the ways in which trauma and control are enacted in the name of saving lives when it comes to eating disorder treatment. And I know that this is a very controversial and sensitive point, but there is a level of traumatization that is often quite ubiquitous in the ways in which autonomy is stripped from people who are experiencing or subject to eating disorder treatment, all in the interests of keeping them alive. That's the justification. But the normalization of harm and the ways in which autonomy are stripped on an institutional kind of level is something that doesn't get talked about enough. And I realize the counter argument to this, and I should have put a caveat around this too, because I realize this is a potentially really triggering topic. So please, take care if you're listening to this. But it's really important to understand, I think, that the systems of mental health support have value, and they are also deeply imperfect. And women's bodies have been monitored and controlled and manipulated and pathologized by psychology just as much as the patriarchy in many ways. There's often been a kind of implicit handshake, and you don't have to go back very far to find diagnoses of, hysterical personality disorder. The big one at the moment is borderline personality disorder. Very gendered diagnoses that at their heart contain some pretty concerning patriarchal themes. And I think that's relevant to thinking about social media. And I think it's also relevant to thinking about eating disorders and the treatment of eating disorders.
I mean, you took like mic drop, first of all. Like that's everything. I fundamentally agree with everything you said. You did say, it's a controversial thing to talk about the harms that treatment can have on people. I can tell you now, not around here, because we talk at length about the episode was released just before this. We were talking about neurodiversity and eating disorders and how trying to fit a one-size-fits-all approach onto people is actually harmful. And there's nothing wrong with saying that you don't understand something, that you don't have the capabilities to do something, and by actively trying to do something you're not qualified for will cause harm. And I completely fundamentally agree with everything you say. And I also agree that, treatment, hands up, saved my life. So it definitely does a lot of good.
It's really complex.
Yeah, but at this podcast, we fundamentally disagree of the stripping of all bodily autonomy, because even when a lot of your choices have to be taken away in certain scenarios, sometimes very much individualized, you still absolutely have a right and a say in your treatment. Even if you have someone to advocate on your behalf, you are absolutely have a right to have a say in the way that you are treated. Hands down, full stop, no negotiations. Second of all, I also totally agree that there should be no separation really of health and science and politics, because health is political. We are seeing that right now as we live and breathe.
Absolutely.
Healthcare is politics. And then the last thing I wanted to just touch on based on what you were saying, we're talking a lot about feminism and patriarchal values here. I don't want any men listening to be isolated here because, first of all, you don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. Welcome, men. We welcome you to join our fight, because feminism absolutely benefits you, just like the patriarchy damages women. It damages men just as much as it damages women. And I think I'd love to potentially see a study in the future of looking at the effects TikTok has on men, and the idea of the ideal man and the muscle dysphoria and this concept of gender and meeting a male sort of ideal as well. I'd love to hear more about that, maybe in future studies. But to circle back to what we were touching on before, when I was mentioning about how long, say on a neutral feed, would it take potentially to be served pro-ana content, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I love that you've asked me this question. And part of the reason is because I actually would love to do a study on this. So there was a study that was released earlier this year that created quite a few waves. It was from Dublin State University. They set up a number of not bot accounts. They set up fake accounts, basically. They set up some accounts on social media platforms. TikTok, I think, was one of them, but there are several, I think, that they looked at. And they told there were no friends of these, because these were just set up accounts. They just entered demographic information. So they didn't have search histories. They didn't have friend lists or anything like that might dictate the content of what the account is going to be exposed to. Now, I mentioned before that the social media platforms are rather opaque when it comes to talking about what influences the algorithm. And we know that search history and who your friends are and all of that kind of stuff is a part of it.
The people you follow, all that stuff.
Yeah. We know that's a part of it. But one of the things that this study showed that I think is really relevant to the context that we're talking about today, they were not interested. This study was not looking at anything to do with women or disordered eating, anything like that. They set up a bunch of accounts that were all set up as though it was a young male user. And for some of those accounts, they did not search for anything relating to misogyny or anti-women content. And for the other accounts, they did search for that kind of content. And the really shocking finding of this research,
I don't want to know, but I also do.
Yeah, it took around 23 minutes, if my memory serves me correctly, for the accounts with no search history, just the demographic information, just the platform knowing that this is a young male user, bang, they're feeding you this anti-women, anti-feminist, misogynistic content. Now, I suspect that the same thing may be happening in terms of disordered eating content for young women. Simply, the platform simply knowing your demographic information, your gender, and probably also to a lesser extent your age, I suspect is probably all they need to point you in the direction of
I
some
wouldn't
of
even
this
be
kind of
surprised
content.
if it's.
No,
I wouldn't
not
even
at
be
all.
surprised if it's faster, to be honest.
Because you know what else in it, and this is this is where we come back to politics, but in a capitalist society, insecurity is deeply monetizable.
And
Fear
as well.
We want you spending money, and spending money is something that the beauty industry and the wellness industry has built its foundations on, and it doesn't do that by making people feel good about themselves. You're not going to spend if you're happy with where you are. So
being content is not if you're content with your life, you don't need that dopamine hit of buying something.
Exactly.
Or of changing something that you feel is inherently wrong, because you might be content with things in your life. Oh my God, I hate it so much.
You mentioned young men as well, and I'm happy to speak to that quickly if you wanted to. That's
please.
Relevance. Yeah. So,
and of course, we're not ignoring. We're talking about like AMAB as well. We're not ignoring gender diverse and trans people either, because we know that that's an absolutely separate thing as well, which I'm sure we can.
Yes.
I'm sure there'd be very similar findings in that.
And we absolutely need research on that. It's relevant to note that in the current study we did exclude trans women from participating, not because their experiences of harm are likely to be any less. In fact, I think they're likely to be greater, but simply because they are more complex, because of you're navigating a much more multifaceted set of societal beliefs, prejudices, etc., etc. So we definitely need research on trans women and trans men, but that is for a separate study to ours because of the complexity that would have added to things. But I want to speak for a second about young men. So first of all, off the back of publishing this research, we had a pretty major kind of response to this in the weeks after it was published, and I did a lot of media interviews in those weeks, and a number of the people who reached out to me were actually young men, which was really interesting because the study was about women. But something I've been paying attention to this last year, and this could take us into some really controversial territory because I'm about to name someone who is really carved out a really popular space in Australian culture, and that is Ned Brockman, who some of you may be familiar with as a long-distance runner who has now completed 2 pretty incredible long-distance running challenges. So if you are like me, you probably, for a period of time at least, have prided yourself on having an algorithm that doesn't intersect with the kind of content that you're going to see from someone like Andrew Tate. Earlier this year, I decided to deep dive the manosphere for research purposes, and I watched quite a lot of content from Andrew, but also from a number of other people like him. And one of the things that blew me away was that I completely expected him to be speaking negatively about women. As a feminist, I'm well aware of the fact that he hates women. What I wasn't expecting was how incredibly punitive and hateful he is towards men a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I watched this and I was like, what's going on here? What's the cachet? What's the pull like for young men to be told you're a piece of shit unless you get up and make your bed and make yourself better and don't be a pussy and all of this really, and
really shaming men. Oh, if you like women, you're gay or something like that, which is so deeply homophobic.
There was a whole period of time where women on dating apps were reporting going on dates and discovering that their romantic partner for the night had not wiped his ass properly, because Andrew Tate, for a period of time, spread a lot of content around, if you happen to be wiping your butt and your finger goes anywhere near Uranus, you might be gay. And I'm not joking. There was a period of time where women around the world were finding, okay, there's a problem here that I can see on my bed sheets. Why is this happening? And when it was investigated, this is where it is. So this extreme homophobia, your face right now is like every person's face, right? And I'm sorry to my mum if you're listening now that we're talking about anuses, but what we're getting to here,
I feel like we've regressed as a society. Like,
we definitely have.
Is de-evolution a thing? Because I feel like we're in it.
Look, I think that's a comment that's been on a lot of minds in recent weeks, especially. But the point here is that, and you might be wondering, I'm doing Ned Brockman a great disservice mentioning him in context to Andrew Tate. I want to be really clear here that somebody like Ned Brockman, who is a long-distance runner, who has done some really incredible things and is a very multifaceted character in his own right, is not Andrew Tate. He is not openly misogynistic.
Absolutely
but what I want to point to here, if we circle back to men and body image, is that we have seen a growing trend in recent years of a couple of things. One is body dissatisfaction around young men.
Yep.
The other is, and particularly after the pandemic, there's been a really big increase in running. You're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing run clubs. People are talking about run clubs as the new dating app. Lots of people are running marathons. It's
because I think the gym was closed for so many people.
Yeah.
And you had to do it yourself, right?
But this is really interesting to me as an academic, because for men especially, the body type associated with long distance running has not historically been one that is particularly connected to masculinity or even patriarchy, because runners tend to be, that it's not the gym bro bulky body. It's, if anything, a more feminized, quite slender physique that you tend to see on long distance runners. So I've been watching this, and full disclosure, I am a runner myself and I'm a long distance runner. So I had personal kind of skin in the game here. And one of the things that I think is happening here that warrants some consideration is that if we circle back to the neoliberal prerogative around self-discipline and putting yourself through pain as a kind of form of moral sacrifice and discipline, as much as I am incredibly impressed by what someone like Ned Brockman has done. So for anyone who isn't familiar with him, he ran from Perth to Bondi, and just recently he ran, I think he was running 160 kilometers a day for 10 days in a row.
Yeah.
So he's doing these really extreme things, and he's garnered a huge following as a result of these things and what he stands for. But there is a part of me that is concerned by this, because I think that there is an element of self-harm that is connected to physical challenge relating to exercise that I suspect has its origin story in some respects in self-flagellation. And you see this in Andrew Tate's content, where he tells young men to be a man is war. It is to be at war with other people, other men, women, and fundamentally at war with yourself, right? And I see these narratives in the gym kind of ultra running space sometimes of conquering yourself. And full respect to Ned Brockman, but I do think we need to think carefully about what kinds of self-harm we consider problematic and what kinds of self-harm we celebrate as a society.
And also putting these kind of people who, yes, they've accomplished many things, but putting them on a pedestal as the gold standard. And when I saw the story of Ned Brockman and his finish line thing, I had very complicated feelings, because they talked about, he ran and his feet were blistered and bleeding and they were all wrapped up, and he went through so many pairs of shoes and he would sleep for X amount of hours a night. And I'm just thinking this is this is like torture. For me, and I'm talking anecdotally here, I've come on a long journey of rehabilitating my relationship with movement, and shifting away from this like exercise to more of like joyful movement, and moving my body in a way that it is good for me, like emotionally, spiritually, not spiritually, but you know what I mean, like
I do.
physically,
I do.
emotionally, and
Yeah,
things like that.
absolutely.
And really putting the joy back into it and not doing things I don't want to, because if I feel like I have to do something, then I know that there's probably something not right there with my relationship with it. And then when I saw this, it really struck a chord with me. I'm like, I feel that there's been so much progress in exercise, and movement shouldn't hurt. But now it seems like it only counts if it does
If
hurt.
it does,
And
yeah.
not just hurts, but is in like crippling pain. And that is just like, it really hurt my soul that, like, again, I think maybe Ned Brockman wants to do this for, I don't know his motivations there, but I think the more media coverage that kind of stuff gets really hurts my heart, especially for a lot of young men who then would look at like, okay, well, I need to now do that. And yeah, or getting upset that their bodies can't do that. And I think there's also a level of ableism to that, of like putting that as a standard. A lot of people can't do that. And yeah, it hurts my soul a lot. I want to bring us back to something that I know you touched on already, but I want to know how TikTok actually responded to your research. Because I've been in research for this show. There have been articles back from like 2020 of the same topics. Oh, it's pushing eating disorder content. Oh, it shows that TikTok eating disorder content is really harmful. TikTok responds. It's been like this for the last like 4 or 5 years or so. And like they say, oh, we want to balance censorship of problematic content, but we, want to ensure that pro eating disorder recovery stuff is still available. And like, oh yeah, we work with NEDA and we work with the Butterfly Foundation. I'm like, that's all well and good, but I don't see it making any difference. So I'd love to know what they said in response to your research.
Yes. Well, look, I think their reps got a bit of a workout. So what happened was that this study was published in a really high ranking, very well-known psychology journal. And the journal selected our research to be covered in their press release that followed for that period. So what happened was, in the course of around 48 hours, I think the study, it's gone around the world. So all of a sudden we were being called to comment, but so were TikTok.
Of course.
And their responses ranged.
Which is responsible journalism.
Yes, correct. Yes. Responses seemed to range. I did read, obviously I didn't speak to them directly, but I know I had conversations with a few journalists who had, and I saw a few responses that they had released in articles that had been published about the study. And I did see 1 or 2 comments where they had tried to minimize the findings in various different ways. But one of the most common responses that we saw, they declined to comment on a number of occasions, but when they did comment, what they tried to say is that we've made improvements since this research was done. Now, something that's important to note here is that when we started to do this research, body standards for women were still quite, there's forevermore has there been thinspiration content. So thin bodies have always been somewhat the standard for women. But at the time that we started to work on this research, the slim, thick physique, the classic Kardashian, small waist, bigger curvy behind, etc., was really having a moment. And some people tried to say that this was inclusive and that it was a step forward because we were celebrating curves. In some ways, I think it's fair to say it was actually a more dangerous standard, because it's actually less, first of all, it's less accessible, but second of all, so for many people, the only way you can achieve it is through the Brazilian butt lift. And that is, I believe, the most dangerous surgical procedure that you can have done.
Yeah.
So putting all of that aside for a second, when we came to the time when we published this research, I thought, I wonder if TikTok have actually done a bit of a cleanup. So we deep dived on the platform, and my co-author had been keeping track of this anyway as a TikTok user, and we sort of knew that the content was still around. But we thought, what happens if we search for this pro-anorexia content? Is it still there? And we found and we saved as many, if not more, videos than we had originally found when we started to do this research, which was actually really handy because I don't know if it was in response to the heat that this created, but in the week or two after the study findings were released, a few people contacted me to say that if I search for this kind of content, I'm now getting a love heart and a message saying, hey, reach out for help if you need it, basically. So they put some kind of thing on the app. Now,
they put a pause point at least.
Yes, correct. Now, whether that pause point is going to be a permanent feature or even if it still exists right now remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But what TikTok have done is really ducked and weaved for a number of years. And keep in mind that this platform has only been around since 2017. So it's not a very old platform. We feel like it's been here forever, but it actually hasn't. And from a scientific point of view, it takes time to do research, and it especially takes time to do longitudinal research. So we are actually still in the early days of understanding how some of these platforms work and researching them. And it's really interesting to me that in terms of the social media ban, there's an interesting caveat that we've had for social media compared to other things. So if you think about children's toys, even if you think about medication, there are pretty hectic approval processes that, whether it's TGA or whatever tests that toys and medications and all those kinds of things have to go through before we deem them safe for young people or for anybody in the case of medications. And the social media platforms have kind of worked in the opposite direction. We've sort of operated on the assumption that they're innocent until proven guilty. And so, look, TikTok have, as far as I'm aware, not really yet given any indication that they are interested in actually engaging with this. It is one thing to say we care about the user, the well-being of our users. I don't care if you're interested in the well-being of your users. What I want to know is, are you more interested in that than your product or your financial bottom line? And I don't think they are. And I don't say that to be, of course they're not. They're a business. And this is why, even though I think there are lots of issues with the social media ban, broadly speaking, I do support the government on that ban, even though I think there's lots of problems with it, because it is creating a lot of heat and the platforms are not going to like it. And a lot of parents have said, hey, what about our individual agency? That it's not working. And it's not working because it's not designed to work. Because when I was a teenager, if you were watching something your parents thought was harmful, you were watching it on the TV and
they would turn it
anyone
off.
could walk in and see that was on. If you're watching stuff on your phone that's harmful, it's incredibly difficult, even for the most invested, conscientious parent who has the time and the resources to try to support their child and monitor their social media usage, for them to really vet what's going on. So I think government intervention is required. And I don't want to blend two issues together too much here, but I think one concern that is really on my mind right now is that we could actually see a sharp uptick in some of this harmful disordered eating content if the platforms are actually able to twist a social media ban to say, well, doesn't really matter if we have harmful stuff on here anymore because there's no super young people on the platform, which of course is ridiculous because adults and people older than 16 are also going to be harmed by this content. But there is the potential for us to put more sharks in the water because we've taken the kids out of the pool.
Yeah, I did have a quick look on to the TikTok community guidelines for shits and giggles just to see what it says. And especially in terms of like content that we ban and is kind of definitely at odds with the kind of content that you absolutely see and what you clearly found. I'll link it in the show notes because it's actually quite interesting to say what they do. But I'll give you a brief overview of like the guidelines. They explicitly break eating disorder content down into like 4 categories, like what's allowed, what's not allowed, what's restricted to users 18 and older. So kind of what you're saying is like, well, they don't really like, yeah, they restrict certain stuff anyway, so it's fine. And then what content is ineligible for the For You feed. And like the not allowed stuff kind of goes like, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect. It's like, oh, we don't show, describing, promoting, or offering of like disordered eating and dangerous weight loss behaviors, quote unquote. I'm like, first of all, should you qualify what dangerous weight loss is? But like extreme low calorie diets, like showing actual eating disorder, like purging behaviors or misusing medications, severe exercise, those kind of things, especially things like body checking and body measurements in terms of unhealthy. And I'm like, okay, well, first of all, we know that stuff exists, but sure. Then the stuff that's restrictive is basically like similar things, but like on a lesser scale. Like, oh, we don't show things such as like extreme intermittent fasting and extreme diets and those kind of things, or, using medications. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm pretty sure we would see things like Ozempic and Mounjaro use, absolutely, for people who are under the age of 18, probably. And then so those kind of stuff are also ineligible for the For You feed and things like that. It's just what they're saying is not allowed is still absolutely allowed, and what's saying is ineligible for to be pushed is still absolutely being pushed. Also, like, it's other content that may not be explicitly like pro eating disorder, but things like mukbangs and things like that, which are or eat with me kind of videos, where it's a lot of people, when they have a hyperfixation on food, especially those who are people who are restricting, who have disordered eating, or who have an active eating disorder, will often consume that because they get a vicarious thrill out of watching other people eat. Then there are like vlogs of like what I eat in a day, which is basically, it's a personal vlog, but it's absolutely still kind of disordered eating content. And then you have like those stupid body challenges, which I'm not going to talk about because I do not want people to go looking for them. It's just like, I think there's a lot of nuance with the content. And then there are people who are able to skirt around these kind of barriers where even if they do ban certain hashtags, they'll misspell them. That we saw that back in, in the 2000s with Tumblr. People would just misspell things. So I think there is a massive disconnect with what they're saying that they're banning and what they actually do. And also, they probably don't care, because what's the worst that's going to happen? They get fined. That's fine. They earn so much.
If the engagement outweighs that, yeah, exactly. I mean, in our research, 64% of participants had seen disordered eating content on their For You page, and that was higher than any other kind of negative content, which was really interesting. But I think that one of the things that we need to be doing here is thinking about online harm and harm that occurs in the real world, if you will, not as two separate spaces. And too often and for research purposes and other purposes, we often do need to draw lines between different contexts. But all of the points that you make about the more nuanced kinds of forms of content, I mean, it's impossible to not have some empathy for social media platforms in responding to those, because harm, particularly if you don't have a good understanding of eating disorders, I'm not sure how closely they actually have worked with people who have that level of understanding, but you need that level of understanding to really be carefully evaluating content, because even the recovery content, the recovery videos often have a really competitive framework to them. And what you see, which I think is often quite troubling, is, individuals will post, content creators will post before and after images of themselves. And what TikTok may not be aware of is that there's a bit of a dog whistle going on a lot of the time among people who've had eating disorders around, competitiveness around who's been on a, nasal feeding tube for the longest. And often the recovery images are still of very thin people who are at the gym and working out a lot, but they're not, look at me, I'm not in hospital anymore. Look at this transformation. Now, I want to be really, really clear here that this is not a critique of individuals. This is a critique of the system, and there are individuals within this that are players. And I think a lot of people in these spaces occupy a dual position of victim and quote unquote perpetrator of harm, in the sense that they themselves have been deeply harmed by body standards and some of their content. A lot of the content creators that are creating this stuff, yes, their content is harmful, but they also are experiencing a great deal of harm. And I think we have to hold space for those two realities at the same time. I want to be careful here, because one of the things I try not to do in interviews is talk explicitly about some of the content that is on the platform.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But this is really, really complex. And until we stop celebrating transformation and emphasizing the importance of self-transformation, which has become a huge part of the therapy TikTok space as well, we are not really going to come to grips with this problem. And I am really concerned by the notion, and this is something that I spoke about a year or so ago, it was a year ago, in a TED Talk that I gave on domestic violence. One of the caveats around whether or not individuals who've experienced harm are considered worthy of empathy and consideration and support is whether or not we perceive them to have helped themselves, which is a very sort of neoliberal, pick yourself up by the bootstraps, make the best of a bad situation. So whether you're seen to be helping yourself, and whether you're seen to be turning your pain into your power. And one of the things that I noticed, and again, this is not a critique of any individual person, but in Australia and around the world, we love somebody who has been through the unimaginable and has turned that thing into who they are. This is what's made me the person that I am today.
Yeah.
What we've seen ironically, as social media has become more dominant and a lot of public figures don't have to go through a third party to tell their story, you see people now like Grace Tame who don't give the public the comfort of this perfect transformation.
Yeah.
And Rosie Batty is another person that comes to mind here. There's not the perfect linear story of harm and then growth, transformation. Grace Tame has spoken about, her ongoing relationship with eating disorders, with, harm in various different forms. Rosie Batty has spoken about how incredibly depressed and how much she suffered after, being Australian of the Year. Those stories are not quite as neat as we would like them to be. Britney Spears is another example, actually,
right?
Of somebody whose story doesn't fit the neat transformation narrative that we often expect people to uphold. And I think it's important to note some of this, because neurodiversity also intersects with eating disorders, and so too, do lots of other conditions, and trauma especially is relevant. And sexual violence is also often a factor for people with disordered eating experiences. So we're never talking about just one kind of harm at a time. And we need to think about some of these big picture factors, I think.
100% agree. And I think there's this, look, I've spoken at length, I think, about the harm before and after photos play in general for weight loss, weight gain, recovery. I just think you shouldn't be putting any kind of body transformations up at all. And I actually did look on the before and after photos are restricted to people who are 18 and older. And I'm like, okay. But I think they pose such harm in terms of curating the perfect story, the perfect ideal body. This is what you should look like. This is what your story should be told. And I think in terms of what you're saying about this story arc of this, oh, she's this brave, amazing woman, or this man had such triumph and look how strong he is. In reality, people who have experienced trauma, who have been traumatized, people who have experienced harm, often come out as very changed people, and trauma and harm doesn't leave an invisible footprint.
Yes,
it's not invisible. A lot of the time you see it. It may not be physical. Sometimes it is, and I feel very passionately about this. Your resilience does not need to be a source of inspiration to others.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Full stop.
Absolutely. And if you are bigger, better, faster, stronger because of
Great.
something that you've been through, then fantastic. That is
Amazing.
wonderful. But it is not
And
a
you can speak about
requirement.
that.
Absolutely. But it is not a
No.
requirement that you are transformed as a result of those experiences. And one of the downsides, there's a lot of positives, and I think it's a net positive that we're talking more about mental health than we have before, and that, you know,
100%.
social media has been a big player in that. But
TikTok especially, about what you were saying about having this platform where people don't need to be a public figure. They don't need to go on book tours. They don't need to, they just need to have an account and share their lived experience, which is great. However, it does get co-opted so much into this glorifying of people's pain and trauma.
Absolutely. And it has also become performative in a new way that troubles me. Because, yes, we're allowed to talk about mental health in a way that we perhaps didn't 5 or 10 years ago, but there are terms and conditions for how you talk about it.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I feel like we could talk for hours, but I want to bring us into a landing and kind of wrap everything up. And I know you've spoken about it already, but I want to really land this question in terms of how can people protect themselves online, especially on TikTok, but at the same time, to lump into this question, because I know that it shouldn't have to be on the users all the time, and it's really unfair that a lot of the time, in order to keep ourselves safe, it's always on us when we realize that there is this big behemoth that's kind of pushing against us. So first, yes, how can people protect themselves online? But also, what would you like to see change in the way social media, but particularly TikTok, delivers its content in general? If I can lump those two questions together.
Two great questions. So on the first, I, similar to you know, resist the notion that individuals should be upskilled to navigate harm. I think that the solution to this problem ultimately lies in structural change rather than individual change. But saying that, we also live in a reality where structural change is very difficult to enact and it takes a lot of time.
And money and
Exactly.
persistence. Yeah.
And we are deeply individualized within those systems. So it is very valid and very understandable that we would think about how do we individually navigate this. I can't rely on a corporate, on a collective to protect me, or even a collective that I can join to kind of mobilize, even though there are some collectives. But broadly speaking, most individuals don't have the level of agency required to isolate themselves from this kind of harm. Now, there are obviously ways of limiting your social media engagement that can be useful here, but it's not realistic for most people, nor is it necessarily desirable to say, well, I'm deleting all my apps, I'm off, there's too much harm here. I think there's two things that are really, really critical. Clearly, the obvious things are to say limit your time and don't search for any of this content. But people often say to me, oh, you know, I don't think this is relevant to my child because they would never search for this kind of content. You don't have to search for it. We know that. You don't have to search for it. And you may not even have to search for anything. That's a question.
As we found out, yeah.
Yeah, that's a question that needs to be addressed. But I think there's two things. One is most of us would look at explicitly disordered content. Even if we're drawn to it, we would understand that it is disordered. It is very easy to find yourself watching videos about your microbiome or, you know, fitspiration and find yourself connecting to the good that is mixed with the bad. Because there are often, and this is true for a lot of content creators, there are some health and wellness experts out there who have a real blurring of messages. Some of their information is valuable, valid, good, and also really disturbing. And you can find yourself signing up to programs and engaging with content creators that on the face of it, some of them even present as very inclusive when it comes to body related content. But if your attention, one of the ways that I try to, and it's a difficult thing to do, but one of the ways I try to manage harm even for myself is when I'm hating my body or looking at myself thinking, I did this podcast interview a while ago and they asked me a question. I can't remember what it was, but I told them I'd done a live TV interview with the ABC a few days earlier. And I was saying, I would love to say that I'm like above this, but I got off that live TV interview. And the first thing I said to my friend who was waiting was like, do you think my neck looked a bit chooky?
Oh.
I was like, what is wrong with me? But I say that because this is all of us. Like, we're all in this constant dialectic between the good and the bad about ourselves. But one of the things that really mobilizes me, particularly in the last week for international events that will not be named, is that every time I hate my body, I'm giving the patriarchy a point.
Yeah.
Because they want me to do that, because when I'm thinking about how disgusting I look in those, not that I don't want to say I'm plagued with these thoughts, because I'm definitely not, but all of us have these kind of like, oh, how do I look? Every time I'm thinking about that, I'm not thinking about the really smart thing that I'm trying to develop for work, or trying to think about the intellectual topics that are of most interest to me, don't have anything to do with the insecurities that the culture is trying to encourage. So I think that kind of thinking can be useful, because what it does is it stops you from thinking this is the standard to thinking this is someone else's standard.
Yeah.
And it's a pushback against that internalization. You're still being exposed to the harm, but you're saying, this is not for me. I didn't come here for this. I came here to think about some other important shit that I'm working on at the moment.
It feels like action.
Yeah, I'm not giving you that level of control. The other thing that I think about a little bit, and this is relevant maybe more for kids, but I think it's relevant for adults as well. So in the context of social media and the social media ban that we've spoken about and harm, parents often say to me, what can I do? I do not want my child to be exposed to harm. What can I do? And at the end of the day, the answer to that question is not a lot, because we know that parents, regardless of social media, harm exists in the world. And some of that harm is on social media, but it is everywhere. It is in the air that we breathe. It is a part of patriarchal systems. And I don't say that to create this sort of fatalistic learned helplessness lens to everything, but it is to acknowledge that you don't have full control. And that can be a frightening thing to acknowledge, but it can also be very freeing as well. And what I would say to parents, and I think this is relevant for adults as well to think about in terms of yourself, is you can't avoid the harm, but you can nurture the people around you, whether that's your children or your friends, or, so that when that harm comes their way, it's a bit like, I think about it a little bit like the myelin sheath that protects the neural pathways in your brain, the white matter in your brain that serves as this like protective wraparound to, so that when you do experience harm, which you will, you have as much in your toolkit as possible to handle it. And sometimes I think we think that discipline is the key, but it's not, it's nurturance. And if there's one finding that's repeated over and over again in psychology, it is that social support is the panacea for many, many forms of harm. And one of the things about social media is that the word social is actually a misappropriation in a sense, because you're never being social when you're on it. You can't have a conversation with someone else while you watch videos. You couldn't hear the two things properly at the same time. You feel like it's social because you're connecting to whoever it is that you're watching on your phone, but that's not really connection, that's consumption.
Yeah.
So the word social, it's actually not really social media in the true sense
media
of the word social. It's digital, exactly. So I think that, I don't want to suggest that we can just love ourselves out of this problem, and I'm a bit against the idea of self-care and self-love as being this, that's just more labor often for people to perform.
And it
But
feels disingenuous a lot of the time.
yeah, but I mean, the conversation that we've had today, and I'm imagining that people who might be listening to this episode, if you're listening to this, you probably are invested in these conversations. And having these kinds of conversations, I think, is one of the greatest ways of protecting yourself. It's not avoiding it. You can't avoid the harm, but you can create a level of a buffer around yourself for when
Yeah.
that happens.
Yeah. I think for me, another thing that's helpful for me, I mean, for me, TikTok abstinence is my way of doing it. And
Mm,
I don't have
mm,
any desire to be on TikTok, especially not after
mm,
this conversation. But one thing that's helped me has really been to diversify my feed. And I actually no longer go on my personal Instagram account anymore. I've actually kind of just logged out of it, and I found great benefits because I felt like there were way too many accounts. I couldn't control as much content. So
mm,
now I've created like a little separate one where I don't post anything. I don't have anyone follow me. Not even like friends or family. No one knows I have it. Well, people know I have it, but they can't find me.
mm,
And I just follow things for me that spark joy. Like I follow art things. I follow satisfying cleaning because that's
mm,
great. I follow like crafty stuff. I follow
mm,
like a few like influencers that I do like, and for some political content. But
mm,
then I don't look at the comment section because I don't need that in my life. And like I follow same with like the Instagram I've got for this podcast. I follow a really mix of diverse bodies, diverse
mm,
views. That I mean, sure, yes, I'm absolutely in an echo chamber, but I don't really mind that. I feel I do have enough critical thinking to be like, okay, I'm sure there's other people saying other things.
mm,
But for me, to try and create a safe space on social media, that has been essential for me and my mental health. So I think, yeah, diversifying your feed is really, really important. And I think just in terms of like the things that TikTok can do, I mean, I think it's kind of clear they could do a lot of things, but whether they will is a different story. I don't think they will.
mm,
So I think I agree with your point. Like, yes, it's totally unfair that all the agency has to be on the user, but I don't see that changing. And I think, yes, that
mm,
idea of acceptance that the harm will be there. It's having good communication, especially as parents for children, but also with other people, in order to help keep each other safe and discussing the kind of content you're seeing and being like, is this normal? Is this a good thing? How does it, and having that real self-reflection of how does this make me feel? And if it really it makes you feel bad about yourself,
mm.
maybe it's time to take a critical eye on the kind of things you're consuming and the role that it's playing, and kind of pushing back, like you said.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's
Absolutely.
good.
And find some trailblazers. And for your
Yeah.
listeners, that might be you. It could very well
Oh
be
God.
this podcast for a lot of people. But I mean, Aubrey Gordon is someone who comes
Oh,
to mind with maintenance phase, finding people who are saying, looking at things differently.
Matt Bernstein is great.
Mm,
Jamelia
absolutely.
Jamil.
Mm,
Fierce Fatty is also an amazing creator. Sharon Maxwell is very, very good in terms
mm,
of her story is incredible. There's a lot of people doing a lot of amazing work. Or I think all you have to do is kind of, if you want a good place to start, just have a look at who Paved with Gold is following on Instagram and kind of give you a good start. And a lot of people are on TikTok as well. But seek out these trailblazers and really, find comfort in the fact that
mm.
there are people pushing back. Oh my goodness, this has been such an amazing chat. We covered more things than I even thought we were going to cover, and honestly, it has been. I'm. I'm. Thank you for allowing me to explore the mind palace that is your brain, because
Bless you.
I didn't even know your background
Mm,
ignorantly of the intersection of feminism and looking at things on the margins. And I think I'm so glad that there are researchers like you who are actually being like, hey, we're not talking about this, let's look
mm.
at this, and looking at a really intersectional lens on how to be better people in society. I'm so thankful for your time. For people who want more of your research, more of you, where can they find what you're doing? Because,
Yeah,
I think it's
no.
amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. That's so kind. And there's something I'll say in a second that I wanted to finish with in light of
Yes.
what you just pointed out. But if you're looking for me, you can just Google me, Dr. Rachel Hogg. You'll find pages where all the different publications that I've had are listed. There's lots of media interviews out there as well that you can watch. There's a TED Talk that I mentioned, which is a different topic to this, but I think that it actually intersects with a lot of the things that we've spoken about today. And there's a few YouTube videos and things like that out there. But somewhat ironically, I find some aspects of, there's an interesting interplay, I guess, between presenting this and talking to to communities and representing research findings, particularly in the media and things like that. So it's always a really interesting thing for academics. We're not really trained to do it, and we don't do it all that much. Actually, we normally talk to each other, and we publish papers that are, read only by other academics. But in the case of the research that we've spoken about today, that study was published in PLOS ONE. And if you search for me, you'll easily find that paper, and it is open access. So anybody that's interested can read that paper. And although it is a fairly technical paper, as all academic papers are, we have tried to represent the findings in as engaging and intelligible a way as possible. And there's also a piece that was published by The Conversation after the article came out as well, which gives a bit more of a Sparks Notes kind of version of what that all covered. And
yeah, I just like, if they want to read a lot of more about the study in a less scientific way, which I have done, just Google your name and TikTok, and it will come up.
Absolutely, it will. Absolutely. And a final point just on what you mentioned, I think it's so important as right now, women's bodies are being monitored in a whole range of different ways. We've spoken
a number
about
of different countries.
Yes. And I just wanted to share a quote from a book, or an essay actually, called Hysteria, Feminism and Gender. This was written in 1993, and this is a quote from a Princeton University professor, Elaine Showalter. And I don't know that she necessarily had any idea at the time that this would be as relevant. She probably would have hoped that it wouldn't be so relevant into where we are right now. But she says, during an era where patriarchal culture felt itself to be under attack by its rebellious daughters, one obvious defense was to label women campaigning for access to the university, the professions, and the vote as mentally disturbed. And I just wanted to finish with that, because I think one of the best ways to handle, when you start to, as I mentioned before, when you start to look at things from different angles and you start to question things, you're going to get some blowback for that, because it is disrupting systems that patriarchy is reliant upon. And anticipating that can be really useful in approaching it. And I think as we, the different forms of harm to which women are subjected under patriarchy intersect with each other, and we need to be having conversations about culture across different spaces.
I was going to comment, but I don't need to, because that's like mic drop. Like, yeah, I think that's a perfect way to like leave this, because so often women who speak their minds just get labeled as crazy feminists. And I think a lot of people hear, and this is why I brought it up earlier, I think people hear the word feminist and they think it's exclusionary to men, but it's actually not. More rights for one person does not mean less rights for you. And it's not pie, honestly. It's equity, not equality, of making sure, recognizing intersectionalities and raising people up based on their needs so that everyone is equal.
Absolutely. And the patriarchy reveres men as a class, but it destroys them as individuals. They are being subjected to enormous harm as well.
Oh my gosh. I feel so enriched having listened to you. And I hope everyone listening feels the same way. I know it was a heavy conversation at times. I know that if you had to stop a few times and come back, because I always criticize myself of these episodes being way too long and not being neurodivergent friendly. But I think, I hope you enjoyed your drive to work and your drive back. But I think it has been such an important conversation. We've touched on so many things, and I hope that everyone listening to this can take something new and something informative out of it and feel empowered, because I feel empowered just even having this conversation, at least being able to be part of a discussion. Rachel, thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I cannot wait to have you back on, because we will. But also I cannot wait to see what else you produce in terms of research, because we need to clone 50 more of you. And
bless you.
Honestly, you're doing amazing work.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to chat with you. And I think there's so many ideas that come up in dialogue that would not come up for any of us as individuals. So much of my thinking is developed and deepened through exactly the conversation that we've had today. So thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. That's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider us giving a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if this episode's resonated with you, share it to a friend. Share it to a TikTok user. That's really helpful. You can follow us on YouTube and Instagram at paperwithgoldpod. Send us an email at paperwithgoldpod@gmail.com or visit our website, paperwithgoldpodcast.com. All those links will be in the show notes, along with extra resources and a few links to where you can find Rachel and all of her amazing work. And until next time, stay safe, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye. This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.